Are you passionate about foreign policy, national security, and the latest in domestic politics? Consider becoming a member of the DSR Network, your go-to source for in-depth analysis and insightful discussions. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code GRADUATE to receive 30% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code GRADUATE. Thank you very much for your support.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. Donald Trump has dangerously escalated his rhetoric about January 6th. At the debate Thursday, he ranted that the rioters are, quote, so innocent, and raged that President Biden should be ashamed for destroying their lives. Then, at a subsequent rally, Trump called for the January 6 hostages, his word, to be released immediately. This came after the Supreme Court issued a big ruling that the Justice Department has misused a federal law in prosecuting those who attacked the Capitol. Trump called this a huge victory, but in an important new piece, former federal prosecutor and legal commentator Andrew Weissman explains that in fact the ruling will only impact a very small percentage of those prosecutions. Still, Trump's hailing of this ruling again shows that if he's reelected, he'll likely pardon all the January 6ers, and the result of this will be that the insurrection could get largely flushed down the memory hole. We're really glad to have Andrew Weissman here to talk about all of this. Andrew, thanks for coming on with us.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
The Supreme Court's ruling concerned one of the statutes being used to prosecute Trump supporters who attacked the Capitol. That law bans corrupt obstruction of an official proceeding, which the effort to sabotage the electoral count in Congress plainly was. But the court interpreted the statute narrowly to only apply to tampering with evidence or documents. Can you explain the ruling for us and why it's problematic?
Sure. So I know this statute really well because the statute and the particular provision that was in front of the Supreme Court was put in place and promulgated by Congress right after the Enron prosecutions that I had worked on. And it was part of a larger effort to fix the obstruction of justice statutes, of which there are many statutes that are called obstruction of justice, but they sort of target different issues. But basically, post Enron, people realized there were a lot of problems with the ways that the old statutes had been written. So with that as a preamble, I think maybe one important thing to state before we get into the weeds of sort of exactly what happened here is I think it's probably important for people to understand that the criticism of the Department of Justice that they somehow were misusing a statute or that this was some far-fetched theory that they were going with to prosecute people related to January 6th is just not true. And there's a way that we know that. There were 15 district court judges that all had the issue of, does this statute, the obstruction of justice statute, it's actually 1512, and it's a provision of it, C2, C as in cat, 2 as in 1, 2. But so this is a sub-provision of it, 1512 C2. And 15 district judges had the legal issue of whether it applied to the particular conduct of attacking the Capitol and disrupting the counting of the electoral votes. And I'll get into the details as we discuss this further. But it's really important to remember that of those 15 district court judges, 14 of them said that this was correct. One judge said, no, they thought that it was wrong. So just and that one judge turned out to be right, but that doesn't mean that the Department of Justice and the 14 other judges were somehow outlandish. And within those 14 judges were 3 judges appointed by Donald Trump. So there was sort of a vast consensus going into the Supreme Court decision that this was actually correctly applied. So I think that's really important background to correct any sort of mistaken or intentional or intentionally misleading narrative that this was some outlier.
So the statute itself, can you just briefly walk us through the wording of it and how the Supreme Court kind of twisted it to mean something different than it really does? If that's an overstatement, I apologize, but maybe it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, I do think they got it wrong, but I'm not going to sort of cast aspersions on this is sort of an interesting decision because it was 6-3, but the 3 were not the normal sort of so-called liberal justices. Amy Coney Barrett wrote the dissent, and she was joined by Justice Kagan and Sotomayor, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, Justice Jackson, actually joined the majority and wrote a separate concurrence. I have my theories as to why she might have joined it, but it was 6-3, but not in a normal spread. And so that sort of undermines an idea that this is somehow ideological. With respect to all of the justices, I think probably for some of them, that is probably a correct assessment. But anyway, let's just get into the weeds for a second. The statute basically says in the first part, C1, Cat 1, says that the obstruction that's covered by that subprovision is about documents, and it's about sort of concealing, mutilating, destroying, altering a record, a document, or other object with the intent to obstruct the official proceeding. Everyone agrees an official proceeding is what Congress was doing on January 6th.
Right. That's not in dispute. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's not in dispute. And then C1 is very focused on sort of the tangible object. But what was at issue was C2. And C2 is this really broad language that just says, or otherwise, that's the key word, otherwise, obstructing, influencing, or impeding an official proceeding.
Right. For listeners, well, I guess what that means is that they're essentially allowing for a broad interpretation of what obstruction of an official proceeding really is, because the word otherwise is non-specific, if I understand it correctly. And so Andrew, the question then becomes, did the rioters obstruct the official proceeding by attacking the Capitol? I mean, that's why they were there. Trump sent them to do that.
Yeah. And so the majority said that if you were simply attacking the Capitol, but you did not have an intent to affect evidence that would be presented at that official proceeding, and they define evidence, that's sort of the expansive part. They define evidence broadly. They say that it can be tangible objects, it can be intangible, it can be witnesses, it can be keeping from the proceeding inculpatory or exculpatory information, it can be doctoring evidence. They said all of that, they said, is encompassed. In other words, they were very clear in 2 sentences to make it absolutely clear that it has to do with evidence, but evidence is defined broadly. And I think that might be in part why Ketanji Brown Jackson voted for this, and she stresses this in her concurrence. And why? This is like what's going on. I think, Craig, what you and I are thinking is the picture behind the scenes. What's going on here is everyone's thinking, how does this affect Donald Trump? Because if you are charged with and you were intended to try to undermine the elector vote, and you were submitting fake elector slates to Congress, or you were trying to mislead as to the true elector slates, that is a form of tampering with evidence. And that, under this decision, should still qualify, so that there should not be an effect on the Trump charges that with respect to interfering with the fake electors. And frankly, even with respect to the people charged with obstruction, all the about 300 or so people who are charged with obstruction, they may still be guilty under this new definition of it having to do with evidence. They may not, though, because the government may not have that connective tissue to show that's what they were doing there.
Now, for listeners, I just want to be clear. What Andrew's referring to here is the fact that some of the criminal charges against Trump are taking place under the obstruction of an official proceeding statute. And Andrew's point is that the way they wrote this opinion means that it won't impact the prosecution of Trump on those charges. The big thing you guys found when you wrote your piece for Just Security website with your co-authors, you looked closely at all the prosecutions of the January 6ers, not Trump, the others, and found that only a small fraction have been convicted so far under that obstruction statute anyway. And even of those who were, many of them were also convicted of one or more other felonies. So the upshot is this really is a minor thing for the prosecution of the January 6ers, right?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. So we did a deep dive for Just Security. Ryan Goodman, my colleague at NYU, and Mary McCord, who I co-host a podcast with, and she teaches at Georgetown. And we did a deep dive, and so you can get all of the granular details. But big picture, without boring people to death, is about a quarter of the people charged in the January 6 cases. So there are about 1,400 people who've been charged. A quarter of them were charged under this statute that was at issue. But within that group, not a single person was solely charged with this. There's nobody who's not facing other charges. Now, there is a small fraction that are facing or facing some misdemeanor charges and no other felony. But there are many people who were charged with this C2 felony, but are facing other felonies or convicted of other felonies. So, yes, some people may need to be resentenced. Some people may find their sentence reduced, but it is a really small number. I mean, we're talking about maybe a few dozen. Obviously, it's important to them, but the idea that hundreds of people are suddenly going to go free just simply isn't true. Every single person is facing or has pled to another crime, many of them another felony. That's quite serious. Fisher himself, the name of the case is Fisher. He is awaiting trial. Other felonies that he is facing include assaulting police officers, and attacking police officers. So he's sort of a good example of, yes, this may affect him if they can't end up charging this particular crime because they can't show that he intended to affect evidence at the official proceeding. He's still going to face felony charges.
Yes, so this is not the grand victory that Trump has said. Now let's talk about what Trump is now saying about the January 6ers. I think this is incredibly alarming stuff. It's very ugly. It's taken a really, really alarming turn. There's the stuff he said at the debate, which I mentioned earlier. Then at a rally in Virginia, he said, "Free the hostages now. They should free them now for what they've gone through." So, Andrew, there was some talk before the debate that Trump might moderate his position on pardoning rioters to appeal to swing voters. He might make a distinction between violent and nonviolent attackers of the Capitol, some suggested. Now, that's kind of a BS distinction to start with, but the point is any such effort to moderate didn't materialize. Can I ask you what you think of this? I mean, he greeted both the debate and the Supreme Court ruling as an invitation to make it absolutely clear that for him and his movement, all the January 6ers are nothing but victims, and the only crime was holding them accountable for trying to violently overthrow democracy on his behalf. Isn't this alarming stuff?
Well, absolutely, because he used to be the head of our justice system. And to me, he is running as a criminal defendant. He is running as an outlaw. There's a long strain of people in the United States, whether you're thinking about old Western movies with the sort of anti-heroes or people being enamored of organized crime figures. He's drawing on a strain of sort of anti-government. You'd understand why. I mean, because he is facing 4 indictments, or actually, I should say 3 indictments, and now an appeal of 1 where he was convicted, that he would do this. What's remarkable is that it's getting that traction. Normally, that the people being enamored of this sort of anti-hero, that doesn't play essentially in the real world when you get to politics and something as serious. And frankly, once you attack the justice system in that way, not just for yourself, but for everyone who was participating, who, by the way, either pled guilty or were accorded a trial, that's how we adjudicate things in this country. In the same way that facts don't seem to matter in MAGA world, that now law doesn't matter. But that is the core of who we are. And, for me in particular, just because I'm a lawyer, I spent over 20 years in the Justice Department, but I also spent 10 years as a defense lawyer. I'm an institutionalist, and this is basically saying we just don't believe in institutions and the way in which things are determined. And my final thing before I get off my soapbox is I just think it's also so fundamentally denigrating of ordinary citizens. These are, I had this feeling when I was in a prosecutor, and people kept on sort of poo-pooing what jurors found and thought, oh, they got it wrong, or we can't really let that person sit because they say they can be fair, but I don't really think that's true. And I was always like, who the hell do you think you are? These are citizens rising to the occasion. Of course, they might from time to time get something wrong. All of us can make mistakes, but to me, it's so disrespectful of citizens, whether they're in New York or whether they're in Texas. It doesn't matter. These are, I think most people, whether defense lawyers or prosecutors, whether people who've sat on juries, whether judges, have a lot of respect for the jury system and think that jurors really do take it seriously and rise to the occasion.
I want to add to what you said there. A hallmark of the MAGA movement is to essentially say non-MAGA America, they're fundamentally illegitimate as citizens, right? Their participation is illegitimate. So the through line is the stuff you said. Whenever a jury hands out an indictment, and we should remind everybody that grand juries are what hand up indictments, right, Andrew?
Yeah, that's more citizen. By the grand jurors are also just citizens,
right? And so the through line here is that citizens are voting on the indictment, they're voting on the verdict, and then they're voting in elections. And Trump and his movement, their core principle is that when they lose elections, when the law is applied to them, the proceedings are illegitimate by definition.
Yeah, something that that Amy Berman Jackson, a judge in D.C., said she handled the Manafort case and the Stone case, that I think was relevant then and is just as relevant now, is that the courts are a place where facts and law still matter. And one of the things that I think that the media needs to do better, and I think politicians, even in debates, and I think, but I definitely think the media is responsible, is that I think people in the media, and I now include myself in that because I do a lot of work on MSNBC, is it's really important to not cover adjectives and adverbs as if it's an argument, and to really talk about facts. Let me give you a really quick example. When Donald Trump says that the New York criminal case was a witch hunt and it was ridiculous, and it shouldn't be, it should be disregarded, it's really important to go to the underlying facts. I mean, the key evidence came from David Pecker and Hope Hicks and Jeff McConney. None of the three were accused of lying by Donald Trump or his counsel. They were not crossed by saying that they are liars. During the summation, there was no argument that they were lying. These are his people. And you can go to the actual evidence and see what they said. It's in black and white.
Yes, 100%, Andrew. And to add to that, let's consider this. I mean, the Robert Mueller probe, which you know something about, a lot of the witnesses were Republicans. They were Trump advisors. Same with January 6th. These are people who testified both before the House committee investigating the insurrection, but also I think we will discover that a fair amount of stuff comes from people around Trump that Jack Smith has amassed. And the critical point is these are people who showed extraordinary courage in coming forward in the face of a movement that's out to destroy the rule of law with violence, if necessary. They showed great courage in coming forward and saying all this stuff.
And what I agree with you completely. What I would add, though, about the New York criminal case is that those people not only were under oath, but they were fully cross-examined. That is one of the criticisms of January 6th was, gee, well, the other side wasn't presented. They weren't really cross-examined. Well, we just had a trial where Donald Trump was entitled to do all of that. He also could have hopped on the stand. He obviously constitutionally doesn't have to, but it's not like he wasn't able to tell his story. So, and he just chose not to. So it's a little, far-fetched, to say the least, if you have people who are still care about facts and law to be denigrating. And that's why I think the big picture here is there will always be people like Donald Trump. Throughout history, there are people like Donald Trump. What is unusual is the enablers, the people who know better. I won't say that there isn't a history of that as well. I mean, the history of people who are enamored of power and money, or who believe that it's appeasement is the proper approach to this kind of behavior, is legion. But the thing that is I think sort of soul-crushing to its core is discovering that the roots of what it means to be part of an American democracy and the values that I thought we'd all been instilled in all of us are really, really shallow. It's like a willow tree as opposed to an oak tree, and so it can easily get blown over.
Well, speaking of that, I want to bring up another hidden reason I think Trump's latest rhetoric is so alarming. He's now bursting with confidence that he's winning this election, so he doesn't think he needs to back off his vow to pardon the January 6ers in order to win. Now, the truth, and speaking of the media doing a better job, which I really appreciate you saying that, and I apply it to myself as well, this is information we should repeat again and again. The polls show majorities in this country think Trump committed serious crimes and take January 6th very seriously. But the question is, will that matter in the election? We don't know. So what's your thought on this idea? Where does this lead us? If Trump wins, won't he be able to say, the public agreed with me about January 6th, the violent insurrection wasn't criminal or even wrong, it was for a good cause? He can say the public agrees that law enforcement's efforts to prosecute insurrectionists were themselves deeply corrupt. Law enforcement are the real criminals. And Andrew, this flips the whole story on its head, and I think that leads somewhere very dark. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, I do think that politicians sometimes take the wrong message from getting elected, because that it's an interesting brew and mix of things as to why someone wins and why someone loses. And so, but, politicians sort of want to interpret that to be a mandate for all sorts of things that they might not agree on, that the electorate might. So, I don't think that if Trump wins, that there's going to be, if he took that as a mandate to say people approve of the Dobbs decision, I think that would be wrong. I think it's that it didn't matter enough. In other words, they weren't single issue voters on that. But yes, I think it's, again, I very much am focused on the Department of Justice because of my background there. And, I don't really think you have to speculate as to what's going to happen because I lived through, the Sessions Department of Justice, I won't put in the same sphere because I think the reason Sessions had to leave was because he understood that the Department of Justice had to be independent in order for this to have a rule of law. But I think under Bill Barr, we're going to see Bill Barr too. I saw what he did with respect to, let's just take Roger Stone. I mean, the idea is, enemies get prosecuted, friends don't. And you're not going to see another appointment of a special counsel. You're not going to have a Rod Rosenstein, a person who's somewhat conflicted and sort of goes one way than the other, but at least had a moment where he realized that there needed to be a special counsel. You're just not going to have that. And then the people who sort of, I think, are responsible for holding our democracy by a thread, like Mike Pence, like Don McGahn, various people in the White House counsel's office, they're not going to be there. And just to be clear, and this is something Liz Cheney, if you haven't read her book, and she opens on this, is, once you have a corrupt president who's got power over the military, talk about a third world country. I mean, I really think that it makes it very, very hard when the idea is everything's transactional and everything's might makes right. It's really hard to see that we certainly won't be the country that we thought we had.
That's exactly right. And it's probably worth noting a quick irony here, which is that Trump keeps saying that the prosecution of him is Banana Republic stuff, when precisely the opposite is true. He's essentially trying to erase the ability of people to judge between legitimate rule of law enforcement and illegitimate. And that's the real goal. As you say, it's, in Trump's mind, nothing is a legitimate prosecution. The winner prosecutes, the loser gets prosecuted, and that's the way it should be, and that's the way it is, and that's what he will do. He will prosecute as many of his opponents as he can, and as you say, there won't be internal checks in the same way, and that's pretty alarming. That's where it's going.
So I do think that strategy in politics, when you have a weakness of accusing your adversary of doing what you're doing, I didn't start with Donald Trump. That is a sort of time-honored thing that we have seen, and I think it's one where a dispassionate media needs to call those people out and those arguments out. And again, if you go to the facts and you leave the labels aside of saying, this is like saying it's a banana republic, saying it's a third world country. Those are labels that all presumes that facts don't matter. And I think like that's where, for those of us who've been in the justice system, whether it's civil or criminal, facts matter. Look, there's a reason that there were 60 cases where the argument was that the election there was fraud in the election, it was material, and 60 judges said, no, that's not true. Facts still matter. And it was obvious that when Donald Trump was going to now be prosecuted in courts, that the next target for him was going to be the judicial system, in the same way that Greg, as you know, the media was attacked. The Department of Justice has been attacked. All of these are checks on his power. And so it was clear that the next up was going to be the justice system. But what's remarkable is, I keep on sort of using her as an example, is the Susan Collins of the world. She knows, and she's not saying anything. And whatever her calculus is, she knows. And what she thinks she's going to be able to stop this, later, that's not going to happen.
Andrew Weissman, thank you so much for your insights today. Really, really great.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.